The problem is that when someone's turning to surrogacy, it's a very deliberate act, right? There's a
Hmm.
lot of thought and process that goes into this. So these are people who probably begged and borrowed and leveraged themselves to the
Yeah.
hilt to be able to afford this process. And then to be told that their dream is gone because someone was not a good actor is really sad.
Making the decision to build your family with surrogacy can be full of emotions, excitement, anxiety, relief, nervousness, and it can also be full of a lot of logistics. You're thinking about financing, you're thinking about matching and finding that right person. But have you really thought about avoiding fraud? In the summer of 2024, news broke about families missing funds to be able to pay their gestational carriers. A lawsuit claims that an escrow agency in Houston called SEAM had misappropriated funds, and people who were trusting this agency to help coordinate passage of funds between intended parents and gestational carriers had really misrepresented themselves. Today, we're going to learn all about surrogacy and those logistics and steps to help you protect yourself from fraud from Dr. Brian Levine, a reproductive endocrinologist at CCRM in New York and the founder of Nodal Surrogacy Agency. Welcome to the Baby or Bust Fertility Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, a double board certified OBGYN and reproductive endocrinologist who's not only helped people build families for almost 20 years, but I too struggled with building my own family. I did IVF, and I am so excited to share stories and interviews with experts that can help you on your family building journey. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Laura.
I'm so happy to connect with you again. You have such a unique perspective on this really important topic. You're not only a fertility doctor or a reproductive endocrinologist like me, but you've also created Nodal, this amazing way for people to connect. So you're really involved in the surrogacy area of our field. How did that come to be? How did your interests align?
Well, first, it's important to recognize that it is the birthday of Nodal. So we actually just celebrated 2 years of being around.
Oh my gosh,
So
happy birthday, Nodal.
thank you. So it's super exciting because I love telling the story because it's a birthday story. So basically, what most people don't realize is that gestational surrogacy wasn't legal in New York State until 2021. So as opposed to you living in the Pacific Northwest, where it's been kind of almost like the standard of care for a long time, for us, it's actually been an interesting journey because we've been learning how to handle surrogacy and how to move forward with surrogacy in what's truly been kind of like a weird environment.
Hmm.
Um, in 2021, gestational surrogacy got legalized as part of the budget
Mhm.
for New York State. So two key things happened. One was having the ability to use your employer-based benefit solution being the standard of care happened. So if you had an employer that 100 employees or more, they had to have a fertility benefit. That's really cool. And then the other thing that happened was gestational surrogacy finally got legalized.
Hmm.
And then when it got legalized, I got psyched. I was like, it's here, it's happening, it's finally going to be here. And then all of a sudden, I got disenfranchised. And
Hmm.
the story goes something like this. So February gets legalized. By March, I was calling all of my intended parents and single fathers and single mothers and whoever else is going to use a surrogate. And I was like, we did it. It's happening. Like it's finally going to happen here. And then
And
all
so
of a
just
sudden,
to clarify, Brian, for listeners, I mean, people who live in New York were using surrogates or gestational carriers, but they were just not able to do it in the state. They had to go out of state in order to find people to help them build their family. Is that correct?
that is correct. So in fact, you and I have shared cases in the past where actually I've had to send embryos to your clinic across the country to be able
Yeah.
to allow an intended parent from the state of New York to be able to have what feels like something that's normal in the fertility world and something that's
Yeah.
totally within the realm of what we're supposed to be doing as fertility doctors.
Right. So they're able
So
to do it, but they just couldn't go to maybe a lot of the appointments or kind of really connect with their, gestational carriers and so a lot of the, just it's just very different. It opened up a whole new possibility for people in New York. I love it.
or said otherwise, people now had to assume a risk that they weren't taking before, which is the shipment of their embryos. And that was a big deal, right? Because to use an embryo from New York State, you had to transfer it outside of the state. So you had to impart a level of risk that no one else had to do across the country. Well, 47 other states at the time didn't have to do. So March 2021, I'm psyched. I'm calling patients. I'm like, we did it. We've been lobbying. Like, this thing's going to happen. It's real. It's here. Let's do it. And then these weird text messages started going amongst doctors, being like, has anyone actually had a surrogacy case yet? Has anyone actually done a transfer yet? What are your intended parents telling you?
Mm-hmm.
And very quickly, it went from excitement to shock, and I would say disenfranchisement, where basically we learned very quickly that the price of surrogacy was going through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Where we learned very quickly that intended parents were paying numbers that we never thought they were going to be paying before. And what I realized very quickly was that as the demand from New York State was completely outpacing the supply that was available across the country, supply and demand economics took hold. And
Mm-hmm.
then I found that to be really frustrating. And so as a doctor, you and I both took that oath to do no harm. And I felt like the current ecosystem that we saw in 2021 was doing harm because the intended parents were really only able to use certain agencies that were licensed in New York State, right? New York State actually has a licensure for surrogacy agencies. And what we learned very quickly was that it just wasn't what we all thought it was. It was expensive, it was cost prohibitive, it was time prohibitive, and emotionally it felt almost unattainable.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we started Nodal, was to help solve the solution of making gestational surrogacy more affordable and more accessible.
It's absolutely wonderful. And what is the basic premise of Nodal? Because most of the time people are really trying to figure out how to get started in their journey, and they sign up with an agency. And sort of that model has been around for decades in different parts of the country, where the agency, big sign-on fee, saying they're going to work with you to find a gestational carrier. But a lot of drawbacks with that, which I'm
Mhm.
sure you can shed light on, and how Nodal is really looking at this in a different manner.
So when building the Nodal model, one of the things that we looked at was how do we create something that's different? We recognized that we weren't going to be able to serve everyone, right? So certain intended parents really want the handholding, and that's what agencies are amazing at. Agencies are incredible at helping you go from hello to go. You can sign up with them, you can give them a healthy deposit, they can then hold your hand, they can walk you through the process, and you got someone on speed dial, like at a moment's notice. That's what you're paying for. However, what we recognized was that for many people who are using employer-based benefit solutions, they don't have $200,000 just sitting around to be able to actually use that money deployed only for their embryo. Because look, you and I both have kids, and we know that raising kids are freaking expensive. And a lot of people had this like innate fear that if they signed up with an agency, they wouldn't be able to actually afford to go through the process, let alone raise the kid, because they would deplete all of their savings to do so. So what we sought to do was to build a model where we kind of leaned in on technology, where we leaned in on ways to help trim the fat and to help reduce the administrative costs and overhead. And by reducing the costs and overhead, we decided to pass those savings directly on to intended parents. And so by passing those savings on directly to intended parents, we're able to build a lower cost, higher tech, and to be honest, still a high touch experience. But we do it now with a team of only 8 people, when some agencies have between 20 to 30 people working there. What's crazy is the entire premise of doing Nodal was about how do we make it happen less expensively. We never thought that the byproduct of reducing cost was actually going to be increasing speed along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amazing. I love that. Oh, Brian. So the real premise for starting this is I had some patients that were affected personally by the fraud situation in Houston, the SEAM escrow
Mm-hmm.
agency. And I really wanted people to understand exactly what happened, not just hear sort of sound bites or sort of all the really shocking, headlines from social media and in the news. And that's why I wanted to have you on, because you not only are a physician helping people build families, but you have started a surrogacy agency kind of from the ground up and really understand this part of our field in such a unique way. And so I want people to not only understand you and Nodal and what you're doing, but I want our listeners to really learn how to protect themselves from a lot of the fraud that's in the industry. And so I'm so happy that you're here
Yeah.
for that. Can you
So
tell us what happened in Houston or at this SEAM escrow agency?
Yeah. So, any good, I would say, movie or Netflix has what I always call like the three S's. Something sad happens, there's a scandal involved, and it's really salacious. Um, and this breach has all three. So it ends up that there was an escrow company, and I'll explain what an escrow company is in a second. But there was this escrow company that was allegedly run by a sole proprietor, this one woman, and this one woman allegedly was a bad actor. And I keep saying allegedly because the investigation is still going on and the FBI is involved. Um, but from what we have learned and read in the news, was that this company, the entire premise and purpose of this company was to protect the finances of intended parents and to ensure that the finances were transferred to the gestational carrier at set intervals for milestones. Right? What most people don't realize is that when people go through gestational surrogacy, there's a lot of money that has to change hands. And the money that changes hands goes from intended parents, the people looking to have a baby, to the gestational carrier, the person carrying the baby. And there's contractual obligations that have to happen where people have to hit certain milestones. Those milestones could be going to a workup, going to a clinic, getting evaluated, going through embryo transfer, having a successful positive pregnancy test, then going through each trimester, and then ultimately having a delivery. So to make it fair and impartial, what you do is you partner with an escrow company who is the one whose sole responsibility is to help dole out those finances at those set milestone points. And sometimes, because the entire process can be incredibly long and incredibly tedious and circuitous, at times this can take years.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what we learned from this, I'd say, really bad actor, and that's me trying to be as G rated as possible because we know that people are going to listen to this podcast all around the world. This bad person allegedly was using those funds for things that were not directly related to the care that she was supposed to be the custodian of that gestational carrier. And those funds were misappropriated.
Yeah.
And what happened was that in a true Ponzi scheme fashion, it's been alleged that the money was coming in, was then going to pay the bills of someone else, and the money from that someone else was used to pay for something else. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
problem. What's crazy is in this country, people don't recognize that gestational surrogacy is really not regulated. Yes, an escrow business is a financial business, and there will be certain FDIC laws, and there'll be certain banking rules that are held there. And there's a reason that most escrows are domiciled in the state of Texas, for example. But really, there's no regulatory milieu to help protect the intended parents or the gestational carriers beyond the contractual law that happens in each individual county in America. People forget it's county by county and state by state. You can have different rules in New York, as we did till 2021, from New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, from our neighboring touching states.
Mm-hmm.
But effectively, this individual was allegedly a bad person, used these funds for personal use for a bunch of really weird stuff, like starting a vegan leather brand, allegedly, which I just think is so weird. By the way, if you're a vegan, why are you calling it a leather brand? Like, that's also weird. But anyway, um,
Oh,
and it ends up that intended parents and surrogates were really badly hurt.
yeah.
And that's what sucks, is because I know people who got the phone call that we can't find your funds. I know people who work at clinics that got the phone call from intended parents and surrogates. And the problem is that when someone's turning to surrogacy, it's a very deliberate act, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of thought and process that goes into this. So these are people who probably begged and borrowed and leveraged themselves to the
Yeah.
hilt to be able to afford this process. And then to be told that their dream is gone because someone was not a good actor is really sad.
No, it's awful. I mean, there are gestational carriers that found this out in current pregnancies. There are people who had contracts ready to sign, an inability to go forward, and now they're kind of back on wait list trying to figure things out. It is shocking, like you said, like how can something not be protected? Like what can people do to protect themselves from something like this? I mean, this is such a vulnerable situation. These are our patients that are trying to build families, Brian, and they're looking to have guidance and help, the whole point of an escrow, like you said, is to keep the funds safe and that it's an equitable and very clear passage of funds from intended parents to gestational carriers. It's supposed to protect all parties, and to see that protection crumble because of, like you said, alleged bad actor is just heartbreaking. And I'm curious, in this aftermath, have you found a way, do you counsel your own patients differently? Is there something that people can do to try to avoid something like this happening again?
So I love your optimism, which is we think we can prevent the next one from happening. But the truth is, this was a Swiss cheese model. This was just one of those places where all the holes kind of lined up and no one actually kept their eye on this bad actor. And unfortunately, this person, probably suffers from a personality defect. And as we all know that, personality defects, those are the people that you can't treat because they're really bad people. And so this woman actually gave a presentation at the Society for Ethical Egg Donation and Surrogacy Services, also known as SEEDS, in May about disaster cases. And this woman got on stage and was counseling people about how to deal when things go awry. And it's
Oh my
like
gosh, Brian,
shock,
I did not realize that. This
right?
all
And then
came
this
out like a month later.
weeks later, like 3 weeks later, it all
Oh
came out,
my
and everyone's like,
gosh.
how can she get on a stage and speak to people in our industry about disaster cases when she is the disaster? And what we learned was like, there are bad actors everywhere we go, right? It doesn't mean that, just in the escrow business. But the problem is that when we talk about gestational surrogacy, it's so charged in America. And the reason that this conversation is so charged is that it's incredibly opaque, and it feels like it's almost cloaked in secrecy. For example, let's just say like you go to your local kids soccer game, and for some reason someone's like, oh my gosh, Lora Shahine, like you're the one with 100,000 followers. You're a fertility doctor. What is IVF? Well, I bet you before that woman can finish her question about what is IVF, 5 people standing around you will tell you their IVF experience, right? Because it's pretty common and commonplace. But I guarantee that if a single father or gay male couple comes up to you and says, hey, we want to learn more about IVF and surrogacy, people will come in because they're intrigued to listen. And because the reason they want to because the reason they're intrigued to listen is because we don't really talk about it much in this country. You hear about celebrities going through surrogacy. It seems like it's something for the rich and famous. It feels like it's something that's not commonplace. And so what happens is that because we don't have, I would call like community experience, we don't have community dialogue. And so what happens is that people don't know where to turn and what to do. So the only 2 places that people can go to ask for honest advice is, one, to their doctor, right? Because they put their trust in their doctor. And many doctors don't know how it works, or they end up turning to their agency. And what we learned from the Seam breach is that allegedly this woman was paying kickbacks to the agencies that participated with her. And so she was greasing the wheels of referrals. And so there really was this breach of trust that I think goes way past what she did. I think that there's actually a breach of trust that occurs at the level of the agencies that chose to work with her, because in reality, there was something that just never added up. Like things just seemed a little too good for an operation that felt a little too slippery.
It reminds me of Bernie Madoff. Like you're talking about, like there's bad players in sort of every industry, and that was a Ponzi scheme, and people lost their entire life savings and retirement. And like you said, it's not just in the fertility industry. It can kind of be everywhere. We're going to get back to talking to Brian in just a minute and learning more about surrogacy and protecting yourself. But I want to just remind you how important it is to support the show. Wherever you're listening to it right now, follow the show. Be sure and rate and review it. It really helps other people find the show and get the help they need on their journey. I have a wonderful review from Apple Podcasts, just came up pretty recently, titled Thoughtful, Engaging, and Informative. Thank you so much. As an OBGYN seeing women in all stages of their reproductive journeys, I find this podcast so valuable. Dr. Shahine has a true gift of being able to explain difficult and complicated concepts. in a calm and compassionate manner, understanding the unique perspectives that patients with reproductive struggles face. Her research is focused and up to date, and you can tell she deeply cares about teaching us about all things reproductive health. In particular, her episode on getting pregnant after the age of 40 was so informative. I've recommended it already to many of my patients over and over. This is one of my favorite medical podcasts. Wow, that is an incredible review. I'm just touched. So please follow the show, rate, review it, and if there's an episode that's particularly helpful for you, share it with a friend. It really can help others. Now let's get back to talking to Dr. Levine. Another big picture thing that I thought of as soon as I saw the headlines is, like you said, surrogacy, gestational carrier, fertility, IVF, a lot of that is still shrouded in shame. Why me? A little bit of silence to not share. And I thought about all the people that were finally building up the courage to maybe really look into using a gestational carrier because it's the right thing for them medically, seeing that, and then their whole family building journey just getting derailed because this one bad actor is making, fear and sharing, this horrible thing that could happen to people. So it has such a ripple effect beyond just the very personal and horrible people that were affected directly. It goes so much farther than that. And it comes up there's so many other types of surrogacy bad actors or stories. And I do want to talk about some of those too, and sort of how you counsel your patients. Sure. And how Nodal addresses things. Like a certain common question is, well, what if the surrogate wants to keep the baby?
Right.
And there
that's the number one most common question.
Yeah. And so how do you reassure people? How do people protect themselves from that very scary fear?
So what most people don't realize is that the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, or ASRM, has very well written, very concise recommendations. Now, you'll notice I used a very deliberate word of recommendations. They're not guidelines. They're not the rules, and they're not the law. They are just recommendations of how you should provide care. Now, there's also an ethics committee opinion, which I think is really well written as well. And I do recommend that even the layperson listening to today's podcast should read them, because the way that the ASRM bulletins are written is that they're actually meant to be read by the lay public, but interpreted by the medical professional. And I like the way that they're actually very well done. And they're also in Spanish too, which is really cool.
That's great.
But what's interesting about the ethical paper as well as the recommendations paper is that they both have a very strong single sentence, is that the gestational carrier should be done with her family building, period. Mm. So no one is going into these surrogacy relationships, and it's a relationship, right? I hate saying that someone uses a surrogate, right? I talk a lot about empowering the surrogate, empowering the intended parents. It's a partnership, it's a relationship. But no one goes into this relationship wanting an extra kid. In fact, they've gone into this relationship because they don't want another kid. And in fact, typically the people who become surrogates are highly fertile people. So if they actually wanted another kid, they'd be able to do so. So I always dispel the myth right away of like, what if she wants to keep the baby? I always tell them, A, you'll have a great lawyer who's going to protect that for you. B, you're going to have a great psychologist who's going to double click on both of you to make sure that you both understand what you're going through. But C, that keeping of the baby is actually what led to surrogacy being banned in New York State from 1984 until 2021. And there's now case law to say what would happen if that scenario ever did happen.
Yeah, amazing. Well, and also I talk to people about, in that instance, the difference between, you're touching on something that's near and dear to my heart, the importance of language. So what is the difference between a surrogate and a gestational carrier? Because that's also a layer of protection.
So the relationship that led to the law where surrogacy was banned in New York State was what's called a traditional surrogate. And in the traditional surrogacy relationship, it is both the egg and the uterus of the same person. So basically, a male partner or sperm donor could be used for what's called an intrauterine insemination, and that sperm is put at the top of the uterus at the right time in the person's cycle. They then ovulate and fertilization occurs within the body. The embryo grows within the body and implants in almost a natural way. As opposed to what's now done, which is called gestational surrogacy, which is where the embryo originates from a different genetic source than the person who's carrying the pregnancy. And so I always tell people that surrogacy got much more complicated, but much safer. And the reason it got safer is because now you've separated the two. But
Exactly.
by the way, traditional surrogacy does occur. In fact, it is something that Americans are frequently duped by. So when Americans go to, for example, Mexico, and they go to do surrogacy in Mexico, what they don't realize is that many of these agencies are actually offering them for sale, as one of their services, is traditional surrogacy.
Oh my goodness.
So that they don't, oh yeah, this is still going on. And in fact, if you take a look at the summer of 23, so not this summer, but last summer, I was involved in this crazy case. So
Okay.
it was July 4th weekend. I was on call. My wife was with the kids at the beach. And so here I am sitting in my office calling patients. And then I have a million and one Google alerts. And so I'm looking at my Google alerts and up comes this story from the Washington Post. And in this story is a story of a couple who's trapped in Mexico. So of course it caught my attention because it went off on one of my surrogacy, notifications, but it was the Washington Post. I'm like, this is a really reasonable and responsible paper. What are they writing about? And it ends up there was this really cool couple from New Jersey who had gone to Mexico and was told that if they did surrogacy in Mexico, they could go through the entire process there for a fraction of the cost of the United States. And then ultimately, they would be able to have a birth certificate that was American at the time of birth in Mexico, and the baby would be able to come home with them the next day. Well, I read about
Brian,
this.
that all sounds too good to be true.
Yeah. And guess what? It was. So
Yeah.
I read about this case. The baby was born in April. They were still stuck in Mexico as of July 4th weekend.
Yeah.
And it ends up that because of the network that we've built in Nodal of all these amazing lawyers and all these amazing people across the country, I was able to learn that this couple was truly trapped. And they were really trapped down there. So I tried to find the guy on the internet. He wasn't on Instagram. He wasn't on Facebook. But I found the husband on LinkedIn. And I messaged him saying, hey, I don't know you. You don't know me. It's July 4th weekend. I'm a fertility doctor sitting at my desk. I just read about your story in the Washington Post. If you want help, shoot me a message. And I have this surrogacy agency that I've helped form and they might be able to help you. He wrote me back within minutes. Before I knew it, we were WhatsApping. And literally on there, he told me the whole story. And then I pinged my entire network of lawyers through the Nodal network. And it ends up we're actually able to help get that baby out of Mexico 48 hours later.
Oh my
However,
goodness.
what happened? What happened was, one, the intended parents were not fully counseled about what happens when you go cross-border. Second, the intended parents did not even know the resources to look for to be able to gain clarity through the process. And so they were truly victims of a different bad actor. And this was a agency that was in Mexico that had an office in Texas. I mean, it was just so sad and crazy. But they were so desperate for a kid.
Yeah.
And the third thing that happened was that money changed hands. And when money changes hands, you feel like something's really official. So they signed all these documents that had these American birth information and it looked like official US documents. They were all forged. They were
Oh
all
my
fake.
gosh.
And so these people signed all these documents. And so it ends up these lawyers that I was able to find through the Nodal network were then calling the American consulate in Mexico. They were calling the ambassador. Literally people were working on this. And I think everyone was bored on July 4th weekend because the weather was terrible. And people were all messaging each other, but we helped get this kid out. And all I could think about is this is happening every day. And it's happening every day because what people don't realize is that they're so desperate for a baby. They're going to Reddit, they're going to Facebook, they're going across the border, they're going all across the world to try to do surrogacy. And unfortunately, in 2024, we have seen surrogacy banned in more countries than permitted.
Yeah.
You have to remember, the majority of Western Europe has banned surrogacy. Unfortunately, the Pope has come out quite strongly banning surrogacy.
Yeah.
India, it's illegal. China, it's illegal. And so it's illegal in a number of different places, which means that people are either turning to bad actors because now I would say there's a vulnerable population that's out there,
Mm-hmm.
or people are just getting really desperate and they're willing to take the risk.
I remember when there were stories when a lot of these countries banned surrogacy and gestational carriers were pregnant and people were having difficulty getting their children, into the US after all of this happened. I
Oh,
think,
let's try one
wow.
worse. So
Hmm.
so obviously you're smarter than me and all of your listeners know that. Um,
No,
so
not
I'm
true.
gonna quiz you on something.
Oh gosh. Ready.
Okay. Up until 2022, where was the capital of surrogacy worldwide?
Thailand.
Ukraine.
Yeah,
You,
I have heard so many stories about this. Okay.
so
Yes.
Ukraine was the capital of
Oh,
surrogacy
Brian.
worldwide. And when the war erupted, here's what happened. There were a
Hmm.
number of Australian and Irish intended parents, where surrogacy is illegal in both places, who were using services and agents that were local in Ireland and local in Australia that were then partnered with agencies in the Ukraine. So you're following me
Yep.
so far?
Yep.
So like it was an Irish company that was like domiciled in Ireland, but they partnered with like a company in the Ukraine.
Yep.
Well, it ends up when the war erupted, people freaked out. They're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get this kid? How am I going to go? How is she going to be safe? Like, what's going to happen? So they all ran to Poland, and surrogacy is illegal in Poland.
Oh my gosh.
And so they all sought safe refuge in Poland. And then the only way to get a kid out of Poland that's not genetically related to you is to adopt the kid. So then you had to go through the Polish adoption proceedings to actually
Hmm.
have the child who's genetically yours be able to leave Poland, and for you to have the full rights and privileges of being the parent of that child. It was a disaster.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. It is. It's really hard. And I also think about Brian, we're just sort of naturally sort of focused on intended parents because those are the people that are coming to us helping build families. We're doing the IVF, we're helping with embryo transfers. But I also think about protecting the gestational carriers. There are cases of, you know, intended parents abandoning the pregnancies, abandoning the children. I mean, I know that we can kind of talk about individual cases, but just in general, I mean, what protections are out there for the people who are pregnant?
So, it's interesting you bring up abandonment. The reason that Nodal is only for Americans working with Americans is actually to prevent this from happening. Because the majority of abandonment has occurred is international intended parents coming to the United States to do surrogacy.
Yeah.
And in fact, we had something really weird happen in 2020 that led to a lot of abandonment. It was called COVID.
Oh,
So
yeah.
gestational surrogacy has been illegal in China for a very long time. So is gender selection, so is egg freezing, right? Like they're actually behind the times on IVF, even though they have a true population crisis.
Yeah.
And so it ends up in 2020, there were many, many gestational carriers pregnant in California when the world shut down. And they weren't able to come to the US to come pick up their kids.
Hmm.
And so these gestational carriers ended up giving birth to kids that had no parents that were there. So what's amazing is the story of these churches that actually started helping out.
Hmm.
And there's a bunch of stories that no one's ever talked about in California, and I'd love to shed light on them, of these churches and mothering groups who then ended up becoming foster parents to these kids until the intended parents could come from China to help pick up their own children that were there.
Hmm.
So I always say that's the unintended abandonment that occurred. That was a function of the world shutting down.
Yeah.
Then there's the weird one that happens, which still happens to this day, which is someone gets buyer's remorse,
Mm.
where literally they've decided to go through gestational carrier, they go through the whole thing, and they're like, do you know what? We broke up, we got divorced, we don't want a kid anymore. And the kid gets abandoned. And this has happened more often than not with international intended parents.
Hmm.
And so as a result of that, many, many agencies make sure that you have to be on site within the last trimester, especially if you're living abroad. Like there's a lot of things you can do,
Hmm.
but many of the best agencies in America will not work with international parents for exactly this reason.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay, I just appreciate your insight, your expertise. This is eye-opening, but I would love for the listeners to also leave with some hopeful information, some valuable
Yeah.
information. We can certainly talk about all these, disturbing things that can happen, but also the majority of the experiences that I've had, and I would imagine that you've had helping build families, has been incredible. I mean, building these lasting relationships, people who are just so joyous and love caring, love interacting with intended parents. Like most of the time, it is an absolutely incredible thing to be a part of. So, how can people take away some valuable information on how they can protect themselves, because it really is an incredible way to build a family?
So let's start by dispelling some myths and giving people some education. And I think one of the reasons I always love talking to you is that you and I both, I think, recognize that the power of language is so important to patients. And it's like back to kindergarten rules. It's like sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it.
Mm.
Um, and I think when it comes to surrogacy, that really matters because it still feels like something that's opaque. And so, first and foremost, I pray that everyone walks away from this with an appreciation that we won't use the word "I used a surrogate." And instead, they'll say, "I worked with a surrogate," or "I partnered with a surrogate," or "I have the most amazing surrogacy story," right? Like something that's like overtly positive, because in general, the experience is overtly positive for the gross majority. Second, who works with a surrogate? Who ends up going down the surrogacy pathway? This is a common misconception. So I always say there's five main people to think about. The first are the people who can't get pregnant, right? So these are the people who do IVF and embryo transfer after embryo transfer. And every 9 days post transfer, they're getting that terrible phone call saying that things just aren't working. And then at some point, their doctor says to them, this is not an if, this is a when. But to get to the when, we need to deploy a different resource here. And that resource is called gestational surrogacy. So let's just open the conversation to figuring out how we can help you and your family have a baby, even though it may not be the way that you imagined it starting out when you walked into our office, right? So it's the people who can't get pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
the people who can't stay pregnant. These are some of the toughest cases that you and I see every day,
Mm-hmm.
right? The people who have recurrent miscarriages, people who make it to the second trimester and then have a loss, the people who make it sometimes to the third trimester and have a loss.
Yeah.
And either their uterus is damaged, they're emotionally damaged, they're psychologically damaged, their relationship is damaged. For whatever reason, they have decided, or medically it's not sound for them not to be pregnant. And so they need the help of another person. So can't get pregnant, can't stay pregnant. Number three, shouldn't be pregnant. So it is amazing the amount of breast cancer and hormonally responsive tumors that we are seeing every day. And I'm sure it's not just in my practice, it's in your practice and across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And as a society, we've gotten so good at talking about breast health. But what people don't realize that the consequence of breast cancer is that there are an entire population of people out there who now have learned that they should not be pregnant for a prolonged period of time. It could be 2 years, it could be 5 years, it could be possibly never.
Mm-hmm.
And there could be a host of other reasons. People could have a medical complication that prevents them from ever being pregnant. So, can't get pregnant, can't stay pregnant, shouldn't be pregnant. The fourth, would love to be, but is physically impossible.
Yeah.
And those can be your single fathers by choice. Those could be your gay male couples. Those could also be included the women who are born without a uterus,
Mm-hmm.
or those could be people who are born with a severe uterine anomaly. And so there's an entire group of people who would say, I'd love to do it. I would do anything I could to do it, but I physically can't. So can't get pregnant, can't stay pregnant, shouldn't be pregnant, no way they're getting pregnant. And then there's the last one that no one talks about, which is I don't want to be pregnant. And that's called
Yeah.
social surrogacy. Now, some people kind of put this in a negative light, which is the too posh to push group, where they're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't want to be pregnant. I just want to offload this. So I always tell people before you dismiss those individuals, think about what the decision tree is that someone's going through this. It's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly invasive. It's incredibly deliberate. But for some single mothers by choice, where they're the sole breadwinner for their entire family, they want to be able to continue to work, and they might have a very demanding job, or they might have a job that might put their own physical body at risk, where they have recognized that moving through gestational surrogacy is an approach that can help them. So those are the five groups that are out there. And I hope
Yeah.
the listeners can really think about it's not just for the rich and famous. Not once did I mention it's an actor and actress.
Yeah.
Not once did I say it's someone who wants to have twiblings, right? Where they have two kids born within the same calendar year from two different uteri. There's actually 5 real well-defined groups of individuals or families who would partner with surrogacy.
I love that. And I would just add to your 5th group a true fear of pregnancy. Like I've
Yeah.
actually had people who would absolutely love to have a child, would honestly would like to be pregnant, but just truly incredible anxiety, incredible fear-based inability to even think about carrying a pregnancy. It's a true psychological diagnosis.
Or I would say even, and I'm sure you and I have seen this because we're both obstetricians by training, people have had such a traumatic birth that they
Yes,
don't want to do this again, right?
absolutely.
The single most dangerous thing that a woman will potentially do in her life is be pregnant and give birth,
Yeah.
full stop. And for some people, the psychological damage that that will do to them of being pregnant a second time is insurmountable. And we
Yeah.
know that anxiety in pregnancy can make you up to an 8-fold increase for postpartum depression.
Mhm.
And so if you're going to be anxious the entire time and then you're going to be depressed, what kind of parent are you going to be to that kid that's going to need so much loving and caring?
Yeah.
The second thing, surrogacy has gotten better in America. So remember I told you at the beginning of this podcast, we're celebrating 2 years of Nodal. So here's some crazy stats. Since we got started, we've had 20,000 women apply to become surrogates on our platform. In an
Wow.
industry that only does successfully 5,000 journeys a year nationwide, we have seen that by talking to people about respect and in a meaningful way about the opportunity of surrogacy, there's a lot of people who never even knew it existed. So there's a lot of surrogates out there. That's number one.
Hmm.
Number two, we've been able to shorten the waiting time from 9 to 18 months, which is the current average, down to 45 days.
It's
So we
incredible.
have people who are getting literally a baby through surrogacy before they get off the wait list at our competitors. Now, I'm not saying this as a point of like proud puffing of my chest, although I am very proud of this. More importantly, so I'm saying to people is that there is a path forward that doesn't require waiting for a presidential term to end, that doesn't require waiting for 2 years, right? Like this can actually happen much faster than you imagine. And you just have to be crafty about it and partner with the right people. Third, you don't have to mortgage your house. So, we've actually found a way to make this more affordable and more accessible. But what most people don't realize is that I actually can't work with Nodal for my own patients. So the
Mhm.
patients of CCRM New York, because I'm an owner of a practice in New York State, the law states that I cannot self-refer. Right? There's actually a law about self-referrals and there's a Stark law. So in reality, even though I do the most gestational surrogacy in my practice, I partner with agencies every day.
Yeah.
And we figure out how to reduce the cost and to make it more affordable and more accessible to people, even in the traditional model. So it can be done faster, it can be done more efficiently, and it can be done cheaper. And it's not just through Nodal, it's actually the industry in general.
Got it. And then when people are getting ready for this and they're so nervous about some of the bad actors that we've talked about throughout this interview and some of these stories that we're both very personally familiar with, what are some key tips that people can know that they can protect themselves against fraud and some of these bad actors? What are the things that you talk to your own patients about? I'm thinking about like legal and psychological eval, like just being like, how do you look for red flags, when you're interviewing somebody who might be an agent or maybe interviewing like an escrow account? Is there some red flags and green flags that people could look for?
So what I remind people frequently, because I talk about surrogacy every single day, is that gestational surrogacy will likely be the largest expenditure in your life, second to your home. Full stop. It's a lot of money. For some people, it's $100,000. For some people, it's $200,000 or $300,000. It is a lot of money. And you wouldn't make any of those purchases if you're making a $100,000 purchase on a whim without doing research. So do your research. Treat this like the most important expenditure you're going to have. You would never buy a home by just seeing it on Zillow and hitting like purchase, right? You would go, you would see it. You would see what it's like during the daytime. You'd go on the weekends. What is the neighborhood like? Well, you can do the same thing. And what I would tell people that's pretty surprising, and by the way, like There was an escrow breach that happened at a lawyer's office in Minnesota. Like there's been other escrow breaches that have happened. Is that many of these situations have had people who've reported to the Better Business Bureau of the local state. So
Mm-hmm.
it actually makes sense to go look at the Better Business Bureau reportings because people sometimes when they get screwed, get even. And that actually is to help protect you.
Yeah.
And so go take a look at these companies. Second, have the honest conversation with the doctor. If you were me, where would you go?
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason that every clinic in America has a playbook. There's a reason that clinics actually have an agency that rolls off the top of their tongue or they have a top of the referral list because they've had good outcomes.
Yeah.
And so like talk to your doctor, talk to your third party nurses. The third party nurses in a doctor's office, a fertility doctor's office, actually know more of the gossip than you would imagine. And you can tell them like, hey, I'm really intrigued between like agency A and agency B. And they'll be like, look, agency A is highly disorganized. Agency B is not so fancy, but they're phenomenal, right? Like the nurses will tell you. C, there's some really cool conferences that are out there.
Mm.
So you can actually go to the Men Having Baby conference and not be a man.
Yeah.
Men having babies all across the country. And MHB has done a really good job of having a nice dialogue with key players in the field that come together in many different cities. So all the way from Pacific Northwest to Miami to New York City to Chicago. And you can go to these conferences and you can actually talk to people in the field and actually like kick the tires or be like, how do you handle these things? How are you protected? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is your escrow bonded? Which, by the way, if you would have asked that one question, is this seam escrow business where they bonded, you would have learned that she couldn't gain insurance. And that would have been the red flag that everyone would have learned of why you shouldn't have worked there.
That's
But
a valuable tip. Thank you so much. I didn't
but
even
intent,
know to ask that.
right,
Yeah,
but intended parents didn't know to ask that. Right? Like
absolutely.
you would never buy insurance for your car insurance if it wasn't bonded. So now all of a sudden, like, why would you work with an escrow company that's not bonded? But you just don't realize to do it.
Totally. Thank you.
And then there's the last one. I would estimate that you and I spend 20 to 25% of our day de-Googling our patients or effectively undoing
Absolutely.
their, like we are undoing their internet searches, right? Like, the old, hand on the doorknob, you're walking out of the exam room and the patient's like, oh, by the way, I read about CoQ10, which is fine. Like you want to have that conversation.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Or they're like, oh, I read about DHEA. And you're like, oh, I don't want to have this conversation. But I would tell people that when it comes to gestational surrogacy, this is where the internet's actually your friend.
Mm.
And so for those individuals who unfortunately were victims of SEAM, there was a lot of conversation about weird things happening, both in the Facebook surrogacy group and
Mm-hmm.
on the Reddit threads. And what you can start to find on these highly polarized, unmoderated, unregulated boards is a lot of people talking about their experiences. Now, look, you and I have been doctors for a while. We know that most patients will do either a 5 or a 1 when it comes to like your reviews.
Mm-hmm.
And someone like you gets lots of 5s. So like you're a great doctor. But when it comes to the internet of people talking about surrogacy, people give really good nuggets of information. And people tend to talk about their experience pretty openly and honestly because they realize there's no other venue to do so. And so what I'd say is like, this is one of the few times where I tell people, go to the web.
Yeah.
Go to the web, read what people have written, see what people are saying, and you can learn a ton about what's going on in the industry.
Well, and it really ties back to a lot of what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, just about how we need to share more stories and talk about surrogacy and fertility in general. I feel like a lot of fertility fraud has been able to thrive in that era of not sharing information. And when it comes out of the shadows and it becomes out of shame and people are talking about, having a wonderful relationship with their surrogate and partnering with a surrogate, using the right language, sharing their stories at the soccer game, when someone's talking about their IVF experience or their surrogacy experience, then people are going to be willing to share online and truly help each other. Say, hey, I kind of had some red flags when I interacted with this escrow company or this agency. And like you said, part of protecting yourself, even though there are always going to be bad actors out there, is really researching and word of mouth and asking questions from a large pool of people, not just the very first thing that comes up on your Google search. Assume that it's going to go that way. And I think that comes from a lot of just unease, a lot of fear, a lot of just nervous about this process in general. And sometimes the people, the bad actors, have the best selling, personalities and, the shiniest sort of, oh, this is so easy. It sounds so, I'm going to take care of all these things. And behind the shadows, behind the Wizard of Oz, you might not really know. I love that message, Brian. I love what you said. Just research, share, use the right language, be open about it, and when there's going to be less fraud. That's amazing. Thank you.
And I think the other takeaway from this is that surrogacy in America is safe. It's actually the safest place on earth to do so. We have the most case law, we have the most regulations, we have the most protections. And so if you're willing to be a good participant, and what that means is trusting your doctor, trusting the agency you partner with, trusting the surrogate that you partner with, you can have a great outcome. And the gross majority have a great outcome. And it's only a little minority of both the people and the experiences that kind of sours it for everyone else. And so what I would tell people in general is the reason you go to a doctor like you or me is for a very simple request. I want a baby. And if you want a baby, there's a way to do it through surrogacy safely in America.
That's beautiful. Oh, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. Look, I think the more we can talk about this, the more that we can help people understand this is a normal conversation, right? This shouldn't be a special on Laura's podcast. This should be just another episode of the podcast because this is just one of the tools in the armamentarium that we have as fertility doctors to help people achieve their goals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, how can the listeners find you and find Nodal?
So they can go to nodal.com, nodal.com. They can email me directly. I'm totally open to. I go to Zero Inbox every day. So it's brian@nodal.com. And if you're wondering why it's called Nodal, I'll tell you the quick story since it is our birthday. So the first reason is that back to good old medical school, nodal is the gene that's required for all embryos to develop. So I'm a geek, and you can't have a human embryo without the nodal gene. So that's number one.
Oh my gosh.
Number two, we connect nodes of information together. So there's a bunch of different nodes of information. We put that data together, and that's how we help you meet your gestational carrier. And then number three, the most important one, and I hope this is the takeaway for everyone today, is that when you have a tree and a bud forms, the only place that it can form is wherever there's a node. And so nodal is part of building family trees. And so hopefully people will take away from this that we're helping to build family trees every day in a more cost-effective, efficient, and transparent manner.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you again, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. So great to see you.
You too. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Brian Levine as much as I did. I really appreciated his input on a lot of these scary fraud stories that are out there. I love his emphasis on language and the importance of partnering with a gestational carrier to build a family. I think sharing stories, doing research, and a lot of the tips that he brought up could help people use surrogacy as a beautiful way to build their family. You can find this episode and all others on my website, drlorashahine.com. Send us an email to hello@drlorashahine.com for topics you'd like me to cover, people you'd like us to interview, more educational resources on my YouTube channel, Instagram, TikTok. I just love educating. There's a link to my newsletter in the description below. That's a great way to stay in touch every week. I want to thank my friends at Seattle Sperm Bank and Braze Runch Productions for sponsoring the show. I want to thank my producers and team at Audiotocracy. They do an amazing job. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and until next week, I'm wishing you love, luck, and pineapples.